Welcome to AI Talks, a place to come and listen to IBM customers, partners, and colleagues talk about the digital organization and how AI, hybrid cloud, and enterprise software is critical to success. Let me hand over to my colleagues to get us started. Really excited to be joined today by one of our partners, Persistent Systems, and a great friend, Matt Mundell, a solution architect at Persistent. Now, Matt, welcome to AI Talks, and I think you're going to introduce your team.
That's right. Thank you, Paul. So, hi everyone, Matt Mundell here, solutions architect in the UK for Persistent Systems. So I work in a kind of technical pre-sales role with systems and software engineering customers, kind of particularly around the tools and processes that they utilize in their day-to-day business. I've got another member of my team here who works in the European sales team with me. Mark, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Mark Spijkers, Persistent Systems. I work as a client director, working with international customers who are interested in implementing IBM's engineering solutions.
Thank you, Mark. We're talking here today with one of our distinguished engineers, Geoff Clemm. Geoff, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I've been working in this industry for longer than I'd like to remember, but back in the 80s is when I got my PhD in configuration management. Computer science was the general area, but there were one or two of us who were focusing on configuration management. I decided to dive in. Since then, never looked back. A lot of folks change their jobs and change their areas of focus from year to year or decade to decade. I've been doing configuration management since the 80s. It continues to be fascinating, especially the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of focus on something we call global configuration management. How do you manage configuration management that spans many domains, spans many tools? How do you bring it all together? And that's something that I continue to focus on to this day.
How did that work actually first come about? You're kind of focusing on global configurations. You know, what were the first use cases that you saw that caused you to look at that and write about it?
It started very personal. I was getting my PhD, and so lots of great theory of software and formal abstract reasoning topics, and selected one of those. It was attribute grammars at the time, multi-level attribute grammars for defining the semantics of C++. To do that, there was a team of us that I was leading that had to produce a bunch of software. Part of that software was for the companies that were funding us. DARPA was funding us to do tools for the space shuttle. But there was also work I was doing for my PhD. And what we found was that there was lots of things that could have been done better, but there was no software tools to help us do our work. The thing that was particularly missing was how does a team work together? The area of computer science, which is most appropriate for actually solving problems there, turned out to be configuration management, which was still in its infancy at that time. And so we started building things for ourselves. We started then building those things for the grants that we were getting. And that gradually was a great positive feedback loop, because instead of trying to ask some bioengineer what they needed or some space shuttle engineer what they needed, we instead say, what do we need to get our work done? And so we could very rapidly close the loop on, well, we need this, let's build that. We need this, let's build that. In some ways, it was sort of the beginning of Agile before Agile existed. We were a small team and we wanted to get things done quickly. And the advantage was we could ask ourselves what needs to happen. How
has the application of those kinds of principles changed since then?
Yeah, there's been amazing developments and along a number of axes. One of the ones that I think is particularly critical, become increasingly so, if you look at it hard, configuration management was all about reuse, which isn't what people think. It's sort of managing complexity and such, but it's really about reuse. As things become more complex, as the time intervals shorten, your greatest tool to accelerate through all of these challenges is reusing what you've done before, reusing what other people have done. Configuration management is an area of reuse that introduces a lot of magic, right? You can try to reuse something with that, and it's just reusable. Whereas normal reuse systems, you spend decades building up a reuse library, and people don't have the time to do that. Very few people do. Whereas configuration management is sort of ad hoc reuse. One of the things that's evolved over the last 3 decades was that the earlier focus was on reuse of artifacts, reuse of files, reuse of code modules. And that was how to do that most efficiently, most effectively, and there's techniques around that. But as we started moving into the system space, especially where things are safety critical, it's not just the artifacts, but it's the relationships. The relationships between the artifacts, which actually take up as much and sometimes even more time than producing the artifacts themselves. So the fact that this particular requirement is covered by this test case, the fact that this piece of source code is implemented to satisfy this requirement, those relationships in large and complex systems became critical. And how do you reuse those relationships rather than creating them all from scratch? And then phase 3 was saying, well, it's great to have these relationships reused, but what the auditors, what the safety critical systems auditors are saying is, prove to me that this relationship holds. This test case really does cover this requirement because the requirement has changed. And so the pressure increased to actually reuse what we call the validity of those relationships. So not just that there should be such a relationship, but does it actually hold? And if it holds in one variant of the system I'm building, does it hold in this other variant? I'd like the system to magically reuse this information across systems, even if there's different people working on those different variants. And so they don't know each other, they don't know what each other have done, but the system under the hood, if it can derive the validity, it saves a huge amount of rework on the part of the engineers.
I can certainly see those principles alive and well in what we preach to our customers and what we work with them on today. What were kind of the key drivers behind these changes in behavior? What kind of led to thinking about that way of reusing artifacts?
Well, it started fairly simple, which is I've got to release more than one version of the system. And I'd like to reuse pretty much everything from the earlier system in the later system. And that's fairly straightforward. You just change it and you're good. But what happens when you need to make some changes to the earlier version of the system while you're still building the next version, right? You need to segregate those changes that are just for the first versions, and especially segregate the changes for the second version that don't work with the first, but you still want to share some things between them so you don't have to fix all the same bugs twice. And when you have 10 releases, it's fixing all the same bugs 10 times. So that was the initial pressure. But what then multiplied that in a at least geometric and sometimes it feels like exponential fashion is the introduction of variants. In many areas, especially in the systems areas, customers aren't happy with just the next version. One customer wants their variant, which has an electric engine in it. The other one sticks with their gas engine. Somebody comes up with fusion fuel and such. So you have to build many variants, some major like the ones I described, some minor like the entertainment system. But they all want to have each their own variant, and sometimes the same customer wants multiple variants. And so now you have not just multiple releases of the system, but you have multiple releases of dozens and sometimes hundreds of the variants. And how do you manage systems that are growing increasingly complex with increasingly large number of parts and difficult semantics, and you have to maintain multiple variants of them? And the bad news about variants is they're all different. The good news is there's a common core. That's why you call them a variant as opposed to a completely new system. And so configuration management has a huge place to benefits to apply to a customer who has to deal with 2, 3, a dozen, and then up to hundreds of variants in the most complex cases. And how do you get reuse to work across all of that development?
Does that describe the current state of play thinking about global configurations? Is variant management kind of the key driver?
I would say it's the combination of the two things that we've discussed. The first driver is how do you use reuse to allow you to build ever more complex systems for areas that are safety critical, which means that those relationships not only have to be defined, but they have to be audited and validated. So there's that pressure to make sure that all of your safety critical systems are guaranteed to work, because they won't just play the wrong music when you push the button. People can die. It's essential that those work. And now imagine that you have to produce many variants. You have to not only be efficient in how you reuse, but you have to maintain the traceability for all these safety critical systems, both for your own sake, as well as for the auditors. And many of these safety critical system vendors have very stringent and serious auditing processes done by external firms who then you have to prove to them. It's not just, you can't just tell them you did it. You can't just do it a lot of the time. You have to prove to them that you've done it from soup to nuts when you've developing an automated driving system, you have to prove that things aren't going to go wrong. And so how do you do that, right? You could spend your entire year trying to prove that your system does what it's supposed to do while you're supposed to be turning out 10 new variants and 10 new releases of this system. And so it's that combination which I would say has driven both the evolution of configuration management as well as the increased use of configuration management. The old style copy and paste over here and there isn't cutting it at all. It hasn't for a while, and it's becoming clear to everyone that it doesn't cut it even in its beginning once you've got safety critical systems.
Geoff, is there specific requirements a customer needs to implement successfully the global configuration management?
And that actually leads to, so I talked about two axes, the reuse and traceability and reuse of traceability. There's a third axis which comes to play. Originally, the artifacts that you put under configuration management were your code. The code is what mattered. You wrote your code, and that had to be under version control. What then became clear is that that's not enough. Your requirements themselves have to be put under configuration management. You have to be able to work on the second and third release of the requirements in parallel with people implementing the first release of the requirement. The testing has to follow along. So you need variant management of your testing. If you do modeling, which is a highly desirable thing to do, your models have to be under variant management. And so you now have not only your code being driven in multiple configurations in multiple variants, but you have the same thing for all your other artifacts. And those artifacts are finer granular. The requirement is just effectively a text, a paragraph of text. So those have to be stored in order to manage them properly. They have to be stored in a database. And so now you're talking about versioning and variant management of database objects. And that is a huge hurdle. People have figured out how to do files. Database versioning is quite a challenge. And so a customer who wants to really address these kinds of challenges in a complex safety critical world which has many variants needs to adopt sophisticated requirements management functionality, because it's really hard to do this with Excel spreadsheets. You need to have individual versions of each line of the spreadsheet, and Excel doesn't really support that. And then you need to combine them, because reuse matters in the requirements world as much as anywhere else. And then you need to trace these fine-grained artifacts to your testing artifacts, which now need to go fine-grained as well. And so a customer needs to adopt tooling, because this doesn't work with just simple files, to handle the requirements management and handle the test management. And then they need to put all those fine-grained artifacts under configuration management. And so it's a journey. A customer needs to evolve to the point where they say, okay, I've got to handle this reuse problem. I've got to handle multiple variants. The techniques to do that, I have to teach my people how to use these tools that support the evolution of these complex systems. And now I need to layer configuration management on top of that. And so it needs to be done in an automated, seamless, invisible fashion. You can't count on folks sort of just getting it right by hand. And so the adoption and effective use of the tooling becomes a critical step to be able to take it to the level that you see today in autonomic driving automobiles, for example.
Is this a trend in the industry? Are there more industries developing global configuration programs other than other industries? For instance, I can imagine that industries where heavy regulation is mandated, that they are focused on global configurations, or do I see this also in, I would say, marketing-driven organizations with a lot of variants and new products released every maybe quarter, 6 months?
So the short answer is yes. Yes to both. There are multiple drivers that are bringing quite a different class of customers into the use of global configurations. And I should say a word about what global configurations are and why are they called global configurations. The challenge that I alluded to before was that you have to do configuration management, just regular configuration management, not just of files, but also of requirements, but also of test cases. And those applications that handle requirements management, that handle test cases, and more recently that handle hardware parts. Your overall system requires on all of those things being orchestrated together. Each of those systems, especially the hardware and software systems, have developed very different concepts of configuration management. The overall idea can be made relatively uniform at the high level, but when you get down to how it's actually done, it varies greatly, and even from a single vendor, like IBM, like Persistence, right? If you look at how configuration management is done for test artifacts, it's quite different from how it's done for requirements, and yet again, different from how it's done in code, but you have to pull all those together. And that's what global configuration management is all about, is how do you pull together a number of configuration management systems in different domains to pull together into a single configuration or a single set of configurations. So you need to do variant management and configuration management across all these domains, and how do you do that? As increasing numbers of customers, back to your original question, encountered that as their challenge, whether it was from regulatory compliance, whether it was from the driven from market needs, that I need to have a large number of variants to satisfy my customers to beat out my competitors who only have 2 variants, and I've got 24, and you can make an additional 23 sub changes if you want. That would allow you to take over the market, but it requires you to know how to manage that complexity. So whether it's being market driven or whether it's being driven by the inherent need of the system you're building, right? Whether your marketing guys want to do it or not, you have to be safety critical when you're building an aircraft, when you're building a car, and certainly when you're in military. Those are essential. So, but I would say you identified 2 of the biggest drivers. And when you get those 2 combining, where you need to do multiple variants of a safety critical system, then it's a no-brainer. You just have to do it. And those customers were the ones who came in early, and they put up with, there was some, teething pains in the beginning, right? How do you bring all this together? How do you even do versioning and configuration management of a database artifact? Those folks were somewhat patient because the problem wasn't going to go away. And luckily, we've had about a decade to fine tune and evolve it so that things are much smoother for the new customers who are coming in and say, I need this to work. And the early customers took the knocks and helped us. They were partnered with us, right? These were domains that those of us who build software systems, we're not used to building 50 variants of 24 releases that are integrated into hardware systems. So our key partners in the beginning, they showed us what are the techniques that are used effectively and how do you put those under configuration management. So it really has been a partnership of the industries that need it, who've known they need it for like a decade ago. So now we can make it available to a broader range. The people who are more market driven, they didn't have to do it, but it puts them ahead of their competitors.
Thinking about your day-to-day customer engagements that you have, Geoff, what are some of the kind of most interesting changes that you've seen in the last 10 years or so, kind of your customer engagements, and where are some of the most successful ways that you've seen customers adapt, particularly around, you talked about, the need for regulatory compliance and so forth. Where are some of the more interesting or successful examples that you've seen that be implemented?
I would say we're in the second phase of this kind of adoption, and that the engagements I'm having now, which I think I alluded to a moment ago, was from the customers who just knew they had to do it, and they just had to find a way to do it. Automotive customers, the aircraft customers, they know they had this problem to be solved. They'll build it themselves. They built these tools themselves because they couldn't get it from the market. And as soon as they found they could get it from the market, they would breathe a sigh of relief and hand over this challenging problem of maintaining these configuration management systems across multiple domains to a vendor who specialized in it. The next phase is now focusing on the folks who see it as a problem but didn't have to do it, and some of them are being forced to do it because even though they didn't think they were building safety critical systems, they now interact with safety critical systems. So I'm building audio, an entertainment system for your car, and you're thinking, well, that's okay if it glitches on the station, but I'm networked in with the same systems that are actually steering your car. And so all of a sudden, some of the things I do have to be firewalled off, and I have to prove that they're firewalled off. So when I change the station of what I'm listening to or add a new podcast or a new device, it won't cause my car to break suddenly. So an increasing number of customers are being labeled as safety critical when they never were before, and they certainly never thought of them. And so this is new to them. This is completely new to them. And so, and then the other folks, it's for market driven, right? They found that this is a great market advantage to them. So these are the new folks, they're coming in. What are they going to do, right? There's so many things about this that are complex for them. They're used to building software in a much simpler way with fewer constraints. And so that's where I would say, especially over the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years, is when I've spent an increasing amount of my time with those kind of customers. Originally, it was with the sophisticated customers, and I would learn from them, right? I knew how to do configuration management, and they would tell me, well, okay, those artifacts are easy. It's the relationships that are hard. I learned that from them. That wasn't my idea. That was their problem that I had to solve. And then similarly, the validity. I said, look, it's not enough to have these relations. Learning from them meant that I had a better understanding of what a systems engineering world would be. And I find that the new customers that I'm working with are as interested in the system engineering knowledge that I accumulated thanks to these earlier wave of customers, as well as the tooling knowledge. How do I do configuration management? Using the experience of the leaders in this space, making it available through tooling, right? So we not only have me coming in to spend weeks with them in many cases, sometimes months, and in some engagements they actually go over multiple years, as this process takes a while to evolve to the highest levels. That in addition to bringing in the tool expertise, they're counting on me carrying forward the domain expertise about how this is actually done. And there's lots of standards in the traditional safety critical areas like automotive and aircrafts, and those are standards that people like chip manufacturers, the V diagram, the A-Spice, automotive process diagrams that guide you how to do these safety critical systems are now being used in many domains beyond what was originally designed for. And bringing that across in a way that's automated by tooling is the thing that these customers are most appreciative about and seem to get the best acceleration in terms of their movement into this space.
In terms of where we are and kind of looking forward into the future, I mean, we talk a lot in many of our customer engagements around the use of AI, machine learning. But I mean, where do you see things like that going in the next 10 years or so? Are there any trends that particularly inspire or excite you in the world of systems and software development or engineering more broadly?
Well, AI has been a pet topic of mine, both positive and negative, over the decades. And in particular, for folks whose memories and lifespan go back that far, back in the 80s, there was an AI revolution, right? There was hardware, there were machines. The Symbolics machine was designed from the ground up to run AI programs. In fact, my first major system that I built was an AI system, and back then was a lot of focus on expert systems. So we didn't call it AI so much, or at least the implementation of AI back then that was most popular were expert systems, forward chaining, backward chaining. I remember we did a contract for American Express where they wanted to have a next generation AI system that helped them decide whether or not whether charge should go through or not. And it would learn based upon what happened in the past. So fairly classic AI. And there was this boom and everyone felt AI was going to take it. This is back in the 80s, right? Well, if you remember the 90s, AI crashed, right? Symbolics went out of business. And so there was a trough where people said, oh, that just didn't work at all. See, I told you so, the folks who never wanted to learn about this complicated AI stuff. And there have been a couple of waves since then, and there's been a big wave started about 5-10 years ago with smarter planets, and that started to be cognitive, a lot of terminology that associated with the techniques that AI can bring to bear. So I see us now in a second wave, which I think is going to last longer than the first wave. These things have been made real. So the techniques that used to be research topics back when I was doing my PhD, with language recognition, pattern recognition, and actually applying it to real world problems, that's become real. Whether it's weather prediction, whether it's figuring out what parts you need to put in your supply chain to make the Internet of Things work efficiently, that's become real. And so applying that to this domain of software engineering, I believe, is our next frontier. And so in configuration management, I talk about reuse being critical. Well, how do you know what to reuse? Gotten these now millions of parts millions of lines of code, each of which have reusable pieces you've used here and there, these relationships that have held. How do you take, and right now, all this validity is human driven. There's no machine today, state of the art. The system does everything it can to make it easy for you, but you got to go to report, and every time something goes invalid or suspect, you mark it valid. A human does that. We like to bring AI to bear on that. And the challenge here is we're talking about very deeply semantically meaningful things that are safety critical. It's really important you not get that wrong. And today, only humans are trusted for these assertions. We have the building blocks for starting to automate it. And AI is the technique, the understanding the language that's in those requirements, understanding the relationships that are being introduced, and then making inferences, reliable inferences on that. That's the frontier. We're not there yet, but we've got the building blocks, and we've got focused people looking at making this happen. We've got some early examples of requirements quality automation where AI techniques are used to check the quality of requirements. Now, if we can bring that over to generate test cases, so you don't have to, a human doesn't have to do it, and then can validate that the new test cases match the initial requirements. That's on the edge, but that's where we're going. And if we can achieve that, things like autonomic driving and such will be in a much safer place.
We are getting to the end of the conversation, but we, of course, we want some of your advice. Customers are doing a lot, yeah, but what do you think is extremely important, and what would you like to advise and see customer doing, yeah, or equally maybe stop doing things? Can you maybe also explain what a lot of the customers are doing really well?
So it varies. The customers have really smart people who are doing an amazing job. It's kind of like a lot of the things that we see today where I'm just amazed it works at all. When I pick up my cell phone and it does all the things that it does, I'm amazed. Even just the telephone was pretty impressive, but a cell phone is just amazing. And so these engineers who are building these complex systems that meld hardware and software are doing an amazing job through a huge amount of work and a huge amount of brain power. And the trouble is that brain power, it's limited, right? You only have so many rock stars available to you, and you need to make your folks who maybe aren't rock stars, they don't have PhDs or they haven't been working in the industry for 20 years, but you need to make them productive in these complex spaces. And so finding ways to make your whole team productive, right, is something that people are doing well. And this has got nothing to do with configuration management. A lot of times it's agile, understanding these different ways of producing systems, but the intersection of doing things agile and reuse is, I would say, another frontier where folks aren't doing that as well. So those folks doing agile really well. There's folks doing configuration management really well for standard formal processes, but doing configuration management in an agile fashion is something where people need a lot of help. What happens when my requirements change every week, right? And agile folks say, changing every week is what it's all about. But what if you have to satisfy requirements as opposed to just have some stories that are in your backlog that you do, and you need to satisfy the requirements quickly. You need to prove coverage quickly. So it's the combination of doing configuration management and doing it in an agile way, which I think is the area where people need the most help. The second characteristic I would say is one size doesn't fit all, right? Everyone's in a particular place, and these different industries are in quite different places, different levels of sophistication, different things that they do well versus others. There's not a uniform nature of everyone's good at this and bad at that. Everyone's different. And the path of how to go from where you are now incrementally to where you want to be is something that is still a very custom engagement. And so, although maybe in the future an AI program will infer what that is for you, today, that's where customers need the most guidance, is how to incrementally go from where they are to where they want to be. Folks have somewhat of an idea there and they need some guidance there, but how to get there, once you've agreed on what that path is, that's where they need the most help, and how to get there incrementally so that they don't have a big bang where they shut down for a year and develop all these new processes and start up again. It has to be done while the train is moving, while the plane is flying, right? You have to make these adjustments on the fly. how to do that is, I would say, is the area where the customers need the most help, and where I find that the most productive relationships that we have are when we can provide that kind of guide of where you want to go to, but more importantly, what are the incremental ways to get there.
Thank you so much, Geoffrey.
Well, thank you, Paul, Morgan, Matt, Mark. It's been great. I love talking about this kind of thing. It's my day job, but it's also my hobby. So it's always a pleasure.
Lovely. No, thank you, Geoffrey. I can tell, and it's great to have you on taking time with us. Matt, thank you so much.
Paul, it's been a pleasure.
And Mark, of course, to you, my friend, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Paul. It was really an interesting conversation. Every time again, when I listen to Geoff, I learn new things. So thank you so much.
To the listeners, if you enjoyed AI Talks podcast, please tell your friends. Thank you very much.